The only thing I know as moderating a panel is hopefully we can get into some contentious debate, some scrapping, maybe get some boxing gloves on, and try to figure out kind of what this whole arena is. But you know, I'm getting a sense from the crowd, certainly from you guys, that we're all huge champions of crowdsourcing. So I want to put your objective cap on for a minute. How big is this thing? Like, this is the broadest question we'll probably have this whole conference. How, like, if you look at crowdsourcing as a movement, how big is this thing? Is this like culture change in the world is going to change tomorrow and they don't even know it yet? Or is this something a little bit less than that? It's a great tool in the arsenal of marketers and creative people, but no more than that? Or where are we on this? Contextualize, please.
Okay, I think there's two different slices. One is the idea of tapping the minds of many, and I think that frame is transformative. We are moving to, so part of it just looking at the future of work. I believe in the next decade, in many developed countries, we will almost barely recognize the nature of work, the kinds of jobs, the way organization is structured and so on. It is massively transformative. If we look at this idea of distributed work, of tapping the minds of many and the structures around that, I think that's going to be absolutely transformative. If we look at what most people think of when they say crowdsourcing, then no, I think that's something where we will see the degree, hopefully we're getting reasonable, I mean, it still surprised me how many people haven't heard of crowdsourcing. Maybe we'll get to a point where most people who should know that have heard of it, will have heard of it. And what we define as crowdsourcing is a lot of the platforms and organizations that may or may not be a massive movement, of the scale of social media. But it is, possibly a lot more constrained in terms of this idea of crowdsourcing and the way in which we think of that as a bunch of ways of doing competitions and getting specific tasks done.
Do you think, like, are people just doing crowdsourcing, they're not calling it? Is there like a marketing issue of the crowdsourcing business that,
yes,
you should be used as a term more often, but you're doing it all anyway and you're calling it social CRM or
yes, though the difficulty with that is that if everything becomes crowdsourcing, it just confuses people as to, well, what does it actually mean? Well, is everything crowdsourcing? Is one thing crowdsourcing? So that's part of the thing, is crowdsourcing is so vast that it is very difficult for people to get it. And if you start expanding the boundaries of what you're calling crowdsourcing, then people get it even less. So there is, perhaps we do need some wiki branding around crowdsourcing movement.
I'm not up for the job, but Shelley, you've committed your life to this whole arena. We kind of dabble in it on some perspective, so you're 100% committed. We're only somewhat committed here. Why? And is it just going to become bigger and bigger?
I think the question is a good one, because how I kind of characterize it is, I believe crowdsourcing is a democratization of some key processes that have been in place for a very long time, that are being fundamentally changed. So you look at crowdfunding, and the whole idea of a non-accredited investor being able to participate in a venture, that's completely, it's changed. I think you look at access to labor and work, and the different expertise and the different expertise pools and communities that are around the world for access. So again, I kind of go, these processes are being democratized for global participation. And intelligence too. So I always go crowdsourcing, there's kind of three categories. There's funding, access to labor, and then the collective or the intelligence. And again, you look at the work that Innocentive does, you look at our work with USAID, where we, kind of tap the global minds for solutions for better purpose. Again, that's, I could be a field worker in Ghana who has implemented a mosquito net successfully to reduce infant mortality. And I want to be able to share that idea with my colleagues around the world so that they can also implement it. And again, I just think it's the flattening of that. It's making all of these ideas, all of these resources and the capabilities that we have available to anybody. So that's how I characterize it.
Cool. I just want to add one thing about the crowdfunding piece, and so people always dwell on my finance background, but so bring some of that to bear. What I find when you're talking about crowdsourcing, there's lots of people who think crowdsourcing is crowdfunding. Say crowdsourcing, well, what's the difference? When you say crowdsourcing, they think crowdfunding, because crowdfunding has been, in terms of brands and visibility and people understand what it is, that's massive. far more people understand and have seen crowdfunding than they have crowdsourcing in the broader sense.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, I think, crowdfunding is 2 of 22 categories of crowdsourcing, of getting things from the many. So crowdfunding is a very significant shift, and is what I think of as new layers of capital markets. All of the existing layers of capital markets for IPOs and major stock exchanges and so on, they have their place and their role for large capital raising. So now we're getting new ways for capital to be allocated better to new ventures. There are massive regulatory constraints. So even though we had the Jobs Act signed in by Obama on in April last year, the SEC still hasn't got its act together, and basically they're still going to do what they can to constrain it. There's a long, long way to go until crowdfunding really becomes a really broadly available tool for all sorts of new ventures to come. I mean, it's fantastic what we're seeing, but there's still a long way to go in that. But that is what most people think of when they think of crowdsourcing is crowdfunding.
I guess you brought it up, so I mean, I find crowdfunding to almost be like the pop music of crowdsourcing. Like if crowdsourcing in its truest extent is like indie music, like you follow that band around, you live it and you love it. This is maybe just my opinion, but it seems like a lot of people in the crowdfunding space is, wow, we can make money at this now? Well, I'm going to jump through a lot of hoops really, really quick to see if I can get to that. Is there much soul to crowdfunding, or no? I'm giving them short service.
I think there is. I think, the general people are taking back some processes and saying, I can fund my neighbor if I want to. And this is, the constructs by which I can do that. I met a young woman, and I think she was from, I want to say Ohio, and she started up a fund that was specifically for women. So women who want to start their own businesses couldn't get bank financing, so she saw an opportunity. She created a fund and started loaning these female entrepreneurs money to get their businesses off the ground. And she has seen, and she's from the financial sector, she's seen better payback rates on the loans that she's doing through her fund, which identified a very unique need than she was as a traditional, financial participant in the traditional sense. So I think these things will just keep happening because, people can't get financed other ways, so they're going to find a way to do it. Whether it's, starting up a page on Kickstarter or, finding out that, me as a community member, I can fund my coffee shop, and that's really important to me, and I want that coffee shop to stay open. So I think it's here, and it'll stay. That's what I think.
Cool. Now, we do have, this is going to be interactive, so hopefully I'm lubricating your next question that you're about to go to the podium. I think there's 4 different things here, so as you think about questions, I'll ask one more, and then hopefully we'll open this up to the crowd. We've all had some experience in this kind of landscape, 5, 10, 15 years experience maybe. I'll give my own personal testimony, and I want to know the one thing from you guys, because when you get into this space called crowdsourcing, it's as much art as it is science, and I'd love to know from you guys, and my personal example is when I created this business all about word of mouth 8 or 9 years ago, I actually sent a message to Malcolm Gladwell thinking, all right, I'll get a form letter back, but he actually answered my message in about 3 hours, nice 7-point crisply worded memo like a good author, and I took all of his feedback except the one thing that I thought, it doesn't mesh with my worldview, and his point was, I think influence is very category specific. You can be influential in cars, but be horrible at shoes. And I just thought at the time, influence is like everywhere. If you have a lot of people and you're connected, and sure enough, making a mistake for a year, I figured out Malcolm Gladwell truly was right again. So in the truest form of Malcolm Gladwellism here, what's the one thing, having spent enough time in this area, that you thought something was going to work this way, and it really works a whole bunch differently in crowdsourcing?
Don't know if I've had any sort of reversals of sort. I would have to sort of dig through a little more. I guess one thing that so I use crowds extensively in my businesses, and my focus is very much on the relationships thing, to my point I was making during my keynote, around finding some really talented people who can build some relationships and build some value with. And I guess part of it is building some reputation systems around that, but it is trying people out. you've got to go through, just to get reinforced again and again and again and again, is that as you're trying to build relationships with people, you've just got to try lots and lots and lots of ones to find the ones that can work the best in doing what you're doing. And that's just something which has just continued to be reinforced. And so we find extraordinary people, but there's a lot of legwork in being able to do that. And that's, as I say, just one approach, one category of crowds is this one where you're looking for extraordinary, talented people in a domain or in their own domain. But there's the legwork, which is to build that, is I think can't be short-circuited.
Shelley, I found it refreshing in your presentation. Not too many people I know that are in these positions of power say, "Oh yeah, we messed up on that one." And I think you mentioned that twice in your presentation. So, is one of the things just tolerance for making mistakes in the mistakes? Based on Ross's comment here in terms of try until you get something right, or is there something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're innovating, so I think it's quite natural that as part of being an innovator, we're going to have successes and failures. There's probably a couple of things that come to mind on that, though. One would be when we first went to market in 2009, we had like this really awesome crowdsourcing platform, and we went out to the world and we're like, hey, it's software as a service, come buy it from us, it's going to work, everything will be fine. And what we found was that nobody wanted to buy the technology. They wanted our expertise packaged up into a service, and that was considered probably more valuable than the technology. So we kind of shifted our go-to-market from software as a service crowdsourcing platform to a managed service component where the technology or the capabilities in the platform became secondary. So that would be one key thing. I think
it's a huge one, though. Like, I mean,
it's huge. It was like, we spent a year in market, and we were like, well, okay, I guess we were wrong.
Yeah.
So we, in essence, did our own market test. And I would, I was just talking to a young man on the break here, and I would encourage any new entrepreneur who's looking to start their own business, do an active market test. So test out what your market wants before you make a whole bunch of assumptions and start delivering it. So that would be one. I would say another one would be, I mentioned this earlier and kind of made mention to Ross too, is that whole idea of, the same, mob of people that give you ideas can implement the ideas. It's not going to happen. So you can source ideas and insight from the mob, but if you really want to get that disruptive innovation implemented, you're going to have to find the leaders in that group to make it happen. And we really learned that back in our Cambrian House days. And because I believe in threes, my third one would be, incentives and motivations for different types of crowd participants, and really understanding what motivates them and making sure that the incentives that you build in your communities or your programs are aligned with them. Otherwise, you're not going to get them to do what you want them to do. So,
those are key ones. Just on your rule of three, do you know the third thing in your head as you start in your list of three? Like, is the third thing going, what's the third thing going to be before you finish?
I always know the first two, and then I add the third one in.
I do the same thing.
You can't so much define, the same way you can't define disruptive innovation, but incremental innovation. It's like continuum. So what is your stance on it? Do you rather look for that definition, or do you just define it as essentially democratizing business models and business operations?
And so we couldn't hear, so we will ask people to go to the mics if we can. So just to rephrase or paraphrase the question, it's like, how do you define crowdsourcing? And it seems to be many flavors, and is defining them a good thing, or is there just this continuum that we should be comfortable with? Have I kind of sense your question, or?
Pretty much, yeah. It's a very controversial question, I think. So that's why.
Well, I guess going back, one of the reasons I called my book Getting Results from Crowds was to try to short-circuit the debate around, well, this is crowdsourcing or this isn't crowdsourcing. To my mind, it is about crowds. It is, this tapping the minds of many. And if we start getting into definitional debates around what we include in crowdsourcing, it's less interesting. So one of the, for example, debates is service marketplaces, as in your e-lancers or freelancers, Rodesk, and so on. Are those crowdsourcing? I think we might as well lump them in. They're crowds, even though they are they are marketplaces, as opposed to being able to truly getting many people to contribute something. I mean, why not? Might as well include those as well. So I think we should think about it broadly. As I say, there is a danger then that it starts to become something which becomes too fuzzy that it's, people can't really grasp it. But I think we should be comprehensive. Crowds are about tapping many people, and that is just in a connected world, that is transforming just about everything. The nature of organizations, the nature of not-for-profits, the nature of creativity, the nature of art, the nature of who we are as a society.
You said it was controversial. I love that kind of intrigue at the end of your statement. Is it controversial? Why the controversy? Maybe I'll throw back.
Well, it's really, I'm from the innovation strategist of background, and when people talk about innovation, it's very controversial because usually everybody uses this word, but we need some definition for these terms. Like we need definition of, say, what is design thinking, what is innovation, what is co-creation, what are these things? So with crowdsourcing, it's the same thing technically. If I develop a product as an entrepreneur and I involve, say, I co-create with 10 or more of my consumers, customers, that could be crowdsourcing, right? But it could also be crowdfunding. It could also be essentially getting like the business models to be developed from a network structure, essentially. So it can be so many things, which means that actually we need to decide what is crowdsourcing. Is it more a culture? Is it kind of a business trend, a movement, or is it actually just something people do, like a strategic tool? So that's why I think it's coming.
You want to take a crack at it? I mean, what's your tagline? Do you have a slogan or a tagline that you attach yourself to? And does it have crowdsourcing in it?
We call it crowdsourced market intelligence. But again, I think going back to Ross's comment, I think crowdsourcing is a broad term, and I think the application of crowdsourcing can be quite specific. So I think crowdfunding is an application of crowdsourcing. At least that's what I would say. I would say marketplaces, so 99 Designs is an application of crowdsourcing. So I think the application can be quite specific, but I think crowdsourcing can be quite broad. It's tapping the hearts and minds of many to make something happen. It could be funding, it could be a new logo for my business, or it could be a solution for clean water in a developing country. So I think it's the application that I think is most powerful. Yeah.
Well, one of the critical issues when it comes to crowdsourcing or crowdsourcing ideas is this issue of intellectual property. Because, okay, I can come up with an idea, and my crowdsourcing solution comes very dispersed, and the idea might go through a lot of iterations before actually what emerges is a solution that is well fitted to the market. So that is one critical, because finally you go to the patent system, you talk about the ownership of the idea, exclusive ownership. But when you go through the crowdsourcing, how do you identify that ownership? And ultimately, the other thing is, of course, there are different levels of contribution from a dispersed number of people.
Yeah.
How do you then identify a way of rewarding? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it must produce certain rewards. And there must be systems in place to make this happen. Otherwise, very critically, if such a system is not in place, you do not be able to continue. Because if people who do not feel they are being adequately rewarded, then they drop out.
So just for the sake of the video, I mean, the question's about intellectual property, and I think who owns the end result, who gets rewarded for the end result, and I guess, what's the difference between the old, I'll say the traditional old version of patenting, whatever you're doing, versus something down the road. So there's almost two questions, reward and who own ownership, right? So over to you.
Yeah, so this is something which is of deep interest to me, and part of the thing I wrote about in my book Living Networks is around this idea of distributed value creation. So at the moment, almost all of the crowdsourcing platforms where there is direct intellectual property involved, there is essentially a contract where they give intellectual property. So in Incentive and Nine Sigma, for example, in research and development, basically there is a contract where you get paid a certain amount to give away all of your intellectual property rights. And pretty similarly with most of the creative platforms, sometimes you can retain rights and license it, but it is a very clean intellectual property agreement. So where the opportunity and the massive challenge is these mechanisms to be able to allocate shares in value. Because we have, and for the foreseeable future, this, as you described, this intellectual property domain, there is ownership of something which can be protected by law in terms of a patent, in terms of copyright, in terms of these other structures, and monies will then flow to that owner. What we are on the verge of doing and beginning to do in some ways is to be able to build some structures whereby usually you need some kind of a trust structure or something like that, where you can allocate ownership of a piece of intellectual property among people, or more usually the benefits from that. So rather than saying, okay, 53 people own this patent, one person owns that patent, but there is people are contracted to get some of the receipts which comes from the back end of that. In terms of measuring what are relative contributions, we really need point systems of various kinds. That's what some people have done in some domains. That's part of what we are trying to do in our company, is basically create point systems for people's contribution to be able to allocate, in our case, what we're doing, profit shares from ventures. There's no right way to do it, but there are ways where you can try to do that, saying this is some measure of people's contribution. That can be from hours spent, it could be from the support shown by other people in terms of voting for that. In fact, there's a lot of those mutual vote things to be able to say, well, this is how much I think others have contributed. There's Coffee and Power, which is founded by Philip Rosedale, who founded Second Life, who's got this system internally where people vote on who they think of all of their peers should be receiving portions from the bonus pool. And so there's ways you can structure, these are things which we have to explore. These are the mechanisms which are critical, because as you say, in many cases, some cases you're wanting to contribute for good, some cases you're happy to just take the prize. In many cases, to get the most talented people, they want to share in the rewards of what will be created. And I think there are some great opportunities for those and create those structures.
Yeah, I mean, you've talked about incentives before as well. The continuing ownership piece is interesting, because for most platforms I see, it's like you're getting the intrinsic value of being part of this thing and maybe some remuneration as it happens, but the ongoing piece tends to be lost on a lot of these platforms, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so and again, the organizational structures are starting to be defined where it could be an individual that submits something to an intellectual property request, or it could be a team of individuals that comes forward and does the submission. You'll also see that with some of the, the Nine Sigmas and the incentives, that there might not be the collaboration piece. So it's just a one-to-one submission. So I have an IP idea for craft with one of their food products, or I'm a chemist and I have an idea. It's a single submission to that host company, and there is no collaboration because they exactly can't solve that issue of how to distribute the value of the IP, or it's highly confidential and they don't want it to be public.
I've got a question for the crowd. I'm guessing if you came to a crowdsourcing conference that you are more believers and champions for wanting to have this happen, right? Is there anybody in the crowd here that hates crowdsourcing? Is there anybody middle ground? And you can be middle ground here too, where it's just like, I don't know if this is a good or bad thing, but I'm going to learn. Anybody in that camp? Okay, so we're generally in the camp of crowdsourcing is good, I want to benefit or profit from it, whatever. I know I've had a personal experience. I want these two guys to answer, and maybe we can have some contributions too. The ethics of crowdsourcing, all right? And I'll give you my personal situation. 4 years ago, frustrated with my agency that was helping me out with some logo work, I just, in a fit of rage, said, fine, I'm going to do something on CrowdSpring and just get a logo done for one of these startup things. And I shared this with my world at large, and maybe we've moved on from this a little bit, but the reaction I got, particularly from creative community, business community, of, I can't believe you're turning your back on that agency and giving work for, I must have given a $300 reward out for a good logo, and yet I had 100 people produce different logos. So part of me was a little bit vexed in terms of this equation, but since we're all champions here, I'm guessing we're all maybe a little bit okay with that, but how do we convince others that they shouldn't have a concern with crowdsourcing from an ethics standpoint?
I wrote in my book, Getting Results from Crowds, I tried to squarely address this. And basically I went through this whole thing. These are all the points we could have. Here's one side, here's the other side. So you can sort of, and there's the potential for crowdsourcing to be exploitative. We have to recognize that. We have to address that. So, but people will have different opinions, different views on, what could be considered exploitative, what is creating value, and so on. And I think, that we can always design crowdsourcing to create value. And I think we're seeing many things which are coming from that intent, very specifically, in designing things in crowdsourcing to be able to create value. But I think simply it is all of us must just be aware of and to think through from our own perspective what we are comfortable with, what we feel is right. And so as long as I think, we can have different views on that, we do have to understand that there is the potential for exploitation or value destruction through crowdsourcing, and we just need to understand that and design for that. But I think in almost every case we can design so that crowdsourcing is done in a appropriate and value-creating fashion across the board.
Here's an idea, shouldn't we crowdsource the ability to grade crowdsourcers? A riddle trapped in an enigma, solved by a puzzle.
I thought you were going to say, can we crowdsource the ethics?
No, I'm just thinking
which I don't think.
Could there be a consumer reports for crowdsourcing where it's like somebody externally evaluates, are these people exploitive or are these people great? I think
that's feasible, though I think it is, ethics are an individual thing. We can't tell somebody else this is the ethics you should have, or this is the way in which you should see this. So we can't crowdsource our ethics. We can have a report which may give a judgment, but again, it's up to us to be able to make the judgment as well, if they got the right standards. Yeah. But there is an analog with corporate governance, where you get people that look at companies and saying, are they doing this right? And other people can take that as a guide for making their judgment.
Yeah. Now you seem to be on the good side of crowdsourcing. You don't look like you're exploitative. Maybe I'll learn more about you over the next 2 days, but how do you deal with it? Do you deal with it? Have we moved on? Is this a question of the past?
I think the crowdsourcing arena and the crowdsourcing landscape is already so transparent about what it's doing that I think it's naturally being held to a certain code of conduct or how we will participate together. So I think it's part of kind of the grassroots of its foundation. So that would be one thing. And I think the other thing is, you're talking about getting the logo from, I don't know where you got it from, 99.
From CrowdSpring, but I know
CrowdSpring.
99 Designs is here, so I'm not going to mention 99 Designs 2 more times just so sponsors can be treated better. There he is.
But I think...
Crowd Designs.
But I think...
Or 99 Designs.
They're both very willing participants on both sides. You have, people around the world that want to participate in these communities, and their logo might not be selected, but I don't see a downturn in activity or participation in these communities. They're increasing. So I think people are quite willing to take on that risk and go in and participate and maybe, take their experience and try to generate something for themselves. So I think it's totally cool.
So I'm going to come back at you, okay? I'm going to use a metaphor. Alcohol makes us all feel good, and we should encourage more alcohol consumption everywhere because it tends to make people feel happy. Isn't that the same thing around, I've made you produce a logo and you're happy, and I've allowed another company maybe to exploit you a little because you like being exploited?
Really?
Yes. All right, bad metaphor. You can take the fifth on that one, so.
I'm just curious, the more this crowdsourcing movement grows, and we're seeing a lot of these ethical challenges, is it about time that maybe there's some type of governing body to create some standards? Like, you have the W3C as far as the internet goes. Whenever you have sort of no geographic footprint to kind of confine the movement, you can't really rely on local politics or local policy to... Is it about time that we create sort of an institution that, creates the standards, helps create sort of some level of policy and protects people that are involved in crowdsourcing? The reason I'm asking is because you look at Kickstarter and a lot of these crowdfunding campaigns, and you're seeing people raise money, and they're successful in raising money, but the percentage of people that actually deliver on their promises during these crowdfunding campaigns is quite low, like it's under 50%. So I feel like we're sort of at that point now where we should probably be doing something about it. What are your thoughts?
I think it's a really interesting point. I can't see a way where that would be viable, but let's say it's not a good idea. I mean, for taking the Kickstarter examples, I believe that transparency is the way in which this should be taken, as in, all right, let's find some more about the people behind this. What have they done before? And people to make their own judgments around that. the Australian government has actually told the crowdfunding platforms that they have responsibility for vetting projects. And I think there's a minimal thing, as in, yeah, okay, if things are ridiculous or, there's, clearly something wrong here, you're not going to put it up. But I think we do need to be able to create the transparency. This is about crowds as well. So in a way, to be able to say that the standards body is saying, well, instead of having everybody be able to make judgments, we're going to give one select group or organization to be able to create judgments on the behalf of the crowd. We need to be looking for what are the mechanisms whereby crowds can better police or provide visibility or facilitate decisions. That's not to say, and there have been people who proposed, for example, never paying below the minimum wage in the country which is, you're paying to. I think that's possible. That there is a debate to be had around that. I don't think that would be effective or necessarily even useful. But, so I think that what we should look for more than trying to create governing bodies is create those mechanisms whereby crowds can do what you would hope that kind of standards body to do.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the internet has the IAB, so at least there's some standards around advertising. I mean, implied in your question is not only can we establish rules, but should there be a governing body? Your point of view is, we don't need more. I mean, hopefully the crowds can self-govern. Is there a need for this whole area to have some organization or collective? Maybe this is what comes out of this week, who knows? But
I mean, I think there is already some self-organization. There's been groups like crowdsourcing.org that have, tried to make sense of the landscape. There's, people like Ross that are leaders in the industry. And again, because it's a crowdsourcing industry, I think it's quite natural that, that there would be some level of us keeping us accountable to each other. I don't think a crowdsourcing company or a crowdsourcing model that's taking advantage of its crowd is going to be around for very long, because the group as a whole will call them out, and because there is that level of transparency, people know. So I don't know. I just think it's intrinsic in who we are and what we do. So I don't know if a governing body would be a good idea.
I find it's interesting. I agree with you. Most of the crowdsourcing platforms seem to have understood the basic tenet of how to do this right. I find it when brands individually go out on their own and try to do this stuff is sometimes where the problems come in because of lack of experience. And I hate to say it as a former marketer, we're not really good on this feedback thing yet. So it's like we take your stuff and then say thank you very much. We'll see you next year. So maybe that's where the hurt happens.
But again, I think the brand should be able to get the advice that they need to do this properly. There are lots of professionals in this category now, and I think why would they take that risk with their brand to go out and do some form of crowdsourcing, that hasn't had a consultative approach done to it. Just like you probably wouldn't run an ad without working with an ad agency. So I just think the crowdsourcing agency per se, or having access to that type of expertise, will become normal.
Charlie, you spoke about crowdfunding being an application among many different applications of crowdsourcing. I just want to share, ask from the panel, what is from all the crowdsourcing platform and applications that I've seen around the world, which one, or share one or two examples of most successful crowdsourcing application that you have seen, and how would you define successful at this current stage of the crowdsourcing development? And maybe the last part will be, where do you see it trending towards? In the future, what would be a successful crowdsourcing platform or application?
So a three-parter there. Who's successful, what's the criteria, and who's going to be successful in the future?
There's just so many good examples, and I kind of feel like, I'm biased by, participating in the answer, and I would kind of defer to someone like Ross to go, who are the most successful. I think, organizations that I really admire. So on the crowdfunding side, I know the founder of Indiegogo, and the whole reason why that business got started. I have lots of respect and admiration for their founding principles and what they're doing. So that would be one organization. Help me out here, Ross. No, that's kind of on the crowdfunding.
Look up here.
No. and I know the folks at 99 Designs and have been following them for a while. There's just so many colleagues and peers in the industry that I admire. There's been other groups that, I've kind of questioned again the principles by which they formed their business and went to market. And I would say they've been less successful. So I think you have to be really transparent about what you're trying to do and what you're trying to solve in your application of crowdsourcing. So I don't know.
So a quick one, and I hate to do this, but I think we got to wrap up to make sure we hit our timing. So maybe just answer the question. Maybe I'll just do a quick one-worder back. So.
Oh, just say that there are lots of, in each category domain of crowdsourcing, there's 1 or 2 or 3 major players. What's interesting to me is an industry structure view as the degree of consolidation we're going to see which in space. But we can already point, if you look at my crowdsourcing landscape, each of those categories there's a few of extraordinarily successful firms. The degree to which we start to see many players in a single space as opposed to concentration is one which is a very interesting one. And I think we will see some significant consolidation within each domain of crowdsourcing. We're already seeing massive success in each one.
All right, wrap up. One sentence of advice for people in the audience.
Do it.
Very concise. Thank you, sir.
That's a good one. I was going to say try it. I would say be really respectful of your crowd participant. I think technology can kind of take the human aspect of it away, but I just think each of those crowd participants are human. They want to contribute to your brand or to your business problem, or they want to provide a solution, and treat them with utmost respect. So that would be my thing.